Your great-grandmother knew things about plants that your doctor has never been taught. She knew which bark brought down a fever, which root settled a stomach, which preparation eased the pain that kept her children up at night. She didn't learn it from a pharmaceutical company. She learned it the way people learned things for thousands of years, from the generation before her, who learned it from the generation before them. The doctor in her town knew those things too, not instead of conventional medicine. Alongside it, he had trained at a school that drew on Native American botanical knowledge, European herbal traditions, and scientific medicine at the same time, a school that had been graduating physicians for a very long time. In 1910, a man who had never treated a single patient in his life decided that everything her doctor knew about plants was not medicine. He had a classics degree. The Carnegie Foundation paid him to write a report, and John D. Rockefeller's foundation spent $180 million making sure every medical school that disagreed with him would close. This is the story they left out. Before we get to what was taken, you need to understand what actually existed, because the history you were taught skips this part almost entirely. By 1900, America had 160 medical schools, not one kind of medical school. 160 institutions teaching medicine from genuinely different traditions, each with its own curriculum, its own philosophy, its own understanding of how the human body healed. The dominant tradition was what we now call conventional or allopathic medicine. But alongside it, not instead of it, alongside it, existed schools teaching approaches that had served communities for generations. The eclectic tradition was the largest of them. Its name came from the Latin meaning to select from the best of everything, and that is precisely what eclectic physicians did. They drew on Native American botanical knowledge, European herbal traditions, and whatever conventional treatments the evidence supported. They were not opposed to science. They were opposed to the idea that science meant only one approach. The Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati had been graduating physicians since 1833. Over its history, it trained more than 7,000 students and granted 4,668 medical degrees. It graduated Caroline Brown in 1854, the first woman to receive a medical degree west of the Allegheny Mountains. It graduated some of the first black physicians in America at a time when almost no institution would admit them. It drew on approximately 55 affiliated schools across the country at the tradition's peak. Alongside the eclectic schools were 22 homeopathic medical schools training physicians in a system based on plant and mineral preparations, schools of hydrotherapy, physiomedicalism, naturopathy. A patient in 1900 had genuine choices. Their community likely had physicians trained in multiple traditions. The doctor who set your bone also knew which plants reduced inflammation, which preparations managed pain without the side effects of the new pharmaceutical compounds, which botanical remedies had been used effectively for generations before anyone had a laboratory to study why they worked. This was not folk medicine practiced by amateurs. The Eclectic Medical Institute taught anatomy, pathology, and bacteriology alongside its botanical curriculum. It was not opposed to germ theory. It was opposed to the idea that germ theory was the only lens through which a physician should understand a patient. The herbalist Michael Moore visited the Lloyd Library in Cincinnati in 1990, the archive of the eclectic medical tradition. In the basement, he found the accumulated libraries of every eclectic medical school in America, shipped there one by one as each closed after 1910. A century of clinical observation, thousands of carefully documented case studies, records of which plants worked for which conditions, how they were prepared, what dosages produced results, what combinations were effective. Sitting in a basement, because after 1910 there was nowhere left to teach it. If your family had a remedy that was passed down, a tea your grandmother made, a preparation your great-aunt knew, it came from this tradition. It came from physicians and communities who understood that plants were medicine long before anyone had a patent on a molecule. I want to ask you something before we go further. Did your grandmother or great-grandmother have remedies, things she made or knew, that your family still remembers? Leave it in the comments, because what you're about to hear explains why that knowledge stopped being passed down when it did. And the answers in these comments are some of the most important responses I've ever read. His name was Abraham Flexner, and the story of how a man who studied Greek and Latin came to determine what counted as medicine in America is one of the most important and least taught pieces of institutional history in this country. Flexner was born in 1866 in Louisville, Kentucky. He attended Johns Hopkins University, not in medicine, not in biology, not in any scientific discipline. He studied classics, Greek, Latin. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts. He went on to operate a for-profit college preparatory school in Louisville. In 1908, he published a book criticizing American higher education. Henry Pritchett, president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, read it and commissioned Flexner to evaluate every medical school in the United States and Canada. Abraham Flexner had never set foot inside a medical school. He was not a physician. He was not a scientist. He was not a medical educator. He held a degree in ancient languages. He spent the next year and a half visiting all 155 medical schools in North America. And he published his findings in 1910 as Carnegie Foundation Bulletin No. 4, the document that would reshape American medicine entirely. His conclusions about the eclectic and botanical schools are still in the public record. You can read them today. The report has been available since 1910. He called eclectic doctors drug mad. He described the botanical tradition as based on dogma, the same word he used for homeopathy. He concluded that any approach to medicine that did not conform to the German laboratory science model was not medicine at all. And crucially, the only school that received his unqualified praise was Johns Hopkins, the same Johns Hopkins where his brother Simon Flexner was a prominent researcher. The same Simon Flexner who was the first director of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. The same Rockefeller Institute that had been funding Johns Hopkins. Abraham Flexner's brother worked for Rockefeller. Abraham Flexner wrote a report that praised Rockefeller's preferred institution above all others and dismissed every tradition that Rockefeller's advisor had spent years trying to end. Abraham Flexner was then hired by Rockefeller's General Education Board to oversee implementation of his own report. None of this is a theory. It is documented in Abraham Flexner's own biographical record and in the Rockefeller archive. I want to pause here because I think the specific detail matters. A man with a degree in Greek and Latin who had never treated a patient called 106 years of botanical medical education dogma. He called the physicians trained in it drug mad, and his report became the document that closed their schools. Tell me in the comments, does that strike you as a medical evaluation, or does it strike you as something else? Because I have been sitting with that question for a long time and I want to know what you see. The report itself could not close the schools. What closed them was money. After the Flexner report was published in 1910, Rockefeller's General Education Board began directing its funding to medical education with a precision that the historical record makes impossible to misread. Between 1910 and 1930, the GEB distributed $180 million to American medical institutions. That figure is in the Rockefeller archive. It is not disputed. Not $1 of it went to a homeopathic medical school. Not $1 went to an eclectic medical school. Not $1 went to any institution that taught botanical medicine, hydrotherapy, naturopathy, or any approach that did not conform to Flexner's pharmaceutical model. This is documented in the published research. Frederick Gates, Rockefeller's advisor, the man who personally selected key personnel for every Rockefeller Foundation, had a documented personal opposition to homeopathy that shaped every funding decision the GEB made. He ensured that not one institution teaching these traditions would receive support. The mechanism was not dramatic. Medical schools that received GEB funding could afford modern laboratories, full-time faculty dedicated entirely to teaching rather than splitting their time between the school and private practice. Clinical training facilities, the equipment that Flexner's report had identified as the standard of modern medicine. Medical schools that did not receive GEB funding could not compete. State medical boards, following Flexner's criteria, which had now become the national standard, began requiring that schools meet conditions only well-funded institutions could afford to meet. The eclectic schools, already operating on modest budgets, found themselves simultaneously denied the funding that would have allowed them to meet the new standards and held to those standards as a condition of continued operation. Here is what happened to the numbers. 1904. 160 medical schools, 28,000 students. 1920, 85 medical schools, 13,800 students. 1935, 66 medical schools. 1939, the Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati, 106 years old, 4,668 graduates. The school that had trained the first female physician west of the Alleghenies graduated its last class. A 106-year medical tradition. not disproven, not replaced by something demonstrably better for patients, defunded, and then closed. The consequences extended beyond botanical medicine. 5 of 7 black medical schools closed. Howard University and Meharry Medical College survived. Over 80% of black physicians in America today received their training at one of those 2 schools. The demographic consequences of what happened between 1910 and 1935 are still measurable in the composition of American medicine today. Women were near eliminated from medical practice. Before the Flexner reforms, women were being admitted to medical schools in growing numbers. The consolidation that followed reduced the total pool of medical school places, and the surviving schools reverted to predominantly male-only admissions. By 1970, 60 years later, the proportion of women in American medicine had barely recovered to where it had been before 1910. All of this is documented, published in peer-reviewed journals, available to anyone who reads the historical literature on American medical education. Here is the part of the story that the curriculum built by Rockefeller's $180 million makes absolutely certain you will not connect on your own. The medical model that replaced botanical and eclectic medicine was based on pharmaceutical compounds. The earliest mass-produced pharmaceutical drugs, the ones that began entering clinical practice in the decades after the Flexner Report, were derived from coal tar and petrochemical processes. John D. Rockefeller made his fortune in petroleum. After Standard Oil was ordered to break up in 1911, 1 year after the Flexner Report was published, Rockefeller's financial interests moved into the emerging chemical and pharmaceutical industries. The same petrochemical infrastructure that had built Standard Oil became the foundation of the pharmaceutical supply chain. The medical model that eliminated botanical medicine happened to require, as its primary therapeutic tools, compounds derived from the same industrial processes that Rockefeller's network was positioned to supply. That is not a theory. The connection between petrochemical industries and pharmaceutical manufacturing is documented industrial history. The timing, the Flexner Report in 1910, Standard Oil's mandated restructuring in 1911, the GEB's $180 million flowing exclusively to pharmaceutical model institutions between 1910 and 1930, is a matter of public record. I am not telling you what to conclude from that timing. I am telling you that you were never given the information needed to form a conclusion yourself. Because here is the question that the curriculum built by Rockefeller's money ensured you would never ask. If botanical medicine had been given the same $180 million, if the eclectic schools had received laboratory funding, full-time faculty, clinical facilities, the infrastructure needed to meet modern standards, would they have closed? Or would we today have a medical tradition that combined the century of botanical clinical observation sitting in a basement in Cincinnati with the genuine advances of laboratory science? We do not know, because the funding decision was made before the question could be answered. And the man who made the funding decision also made sure you would not know the question existed. Think about what you just heard. The doctor your great-grandmother visited, trained in a tradition that drew on a century of botanical knowledge, was the last generation of that physician. Their successors were trained in something different, not because the old approach was proven wrong, because the money that determined what was taught went somewhere else. If that strikes you as something worth knowing, leave a comment. Tell me what you're thinking right now, because the comments under this video are where the most important conversations about this are happening. Here is what should make you pause. None of this is obscure. The Flexner Report is a public document, Carnegie Foundation Bulletin No. 4, 1910. It is available at the Carnegie Foundation archives. You can read Flexner's own words about eclectic medicine and homeopathy today. The Rockefeller GEB funding records are in the Rockefeller Archive Center in Tarrytown, New York. The $180 million figure is documented. The exclusion of homeopathic and eclectic institutions from any share of that funding is documented in a peer-reviewed paper published in 2025. The closure of the Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati is in the historical record of Ohio medical education. Its charter, its student files, its faculty correspondence, all preserved at the Lloyd Library in Cincinnati. The demographic consequences for women and black physicians are documented in peer-reviewed journals and in the 2019 JSTOR daily analysis of the Flexner Report's long-term effects. Every piece of this history has been available for over a century. So why didn't your teacher explain it? The same reason your teacher didn't explain the 1865 tax clause that ended local banking. The same reason your teacher didn't explain the 22 greenback members of Congress. The same reason your teacher didn't explain that J.P. Morgan purchased the editorial policy of 25 American newspapers in 1915 and that a congressman entered the full account into the congressional record. In 1902, John D. Rockefeller established the General Education Board. His family ultimately contributed $180 million to it. His advisor, Frederick Gates, wrote in 1906 that the aim of education was to produce in the child a perfect knowledge of what he ought to do and a will to do it, not to ask who funded the report that closed the medical schools, not to understand that the doctor their grandmother visited had been trained in a tradition that no longer existed, not to know that a 106-year institution in Cincinnati graduated its last class in 1939 because the funding that would have kept it open went to institutions that taught the model aligned with Rockefeller's industrial interests, not to connect the defunding of botanical medicine to the growth of the pharmaceutical industry built on petrochemical derivatives from the same industrial network that had produced Standard Oil. The man who funded the report that ended botanical medicine also funded the schools that would decide what the next generation understood about medicine. That is not a coincidence. That is a strategy. And it is the same strategy, the same family, the same network, the same decade. The banks in 1865, the curriculum in 1902, the press in 1915, the medicine in 1910. Different institutions, one direction, one beneficiary. Your great-grandmother knew things about plants that your doctor has never been taught. That is not because those things were proven wrong. The Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati graduated physicians for 106 years. Its library, the accumulated clinical observations of a century of practitioners drawing on Native American botanical knowledge and European herbal traditions and conventional scientific medicine simultaneously, sits in a basement in Cincinnati today. In 1910, a man with a classics degree wrote a report commissioned by Carnegie and funded by Rockefeller. He called what those physicians knew dogma. He called the practitioners drug mad. The Rockefeller General Education Board spent $180 million making sure not one school that taught those traditions would survive. The pharmaceutical model that replaced it was built on petrochemical derivatives. Rockefeller's fortune was petroleum. The Flexner Report is a public document. The funding records are in the Rockefeller Archive. The closure of 94 medical schools between 1910 and 1935 is in the historical record of American medicine. The libraries of every eclectic school in America are in a basement in Cincinnati. All of it is there, available to anyone who looks. The remedy your great-grandmother made, the one your family still half remembers, came from a tradition of medicine that was not disproven. It was defunded. And the generation of physicians who would have continued teaching it never graduated. That is the history they left out. And now you have it.